In 323 BC, a tense silence reigned in the luxurious chambers of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian palace. Alexander the Great, the 32-year-old ruler of a vast empire, was fading away. His mighty body, which had once conquered half the world, was exhausted by disease. His voice was hoarse. Even the best healers were powerless in the face of impending death. Around him, his entourage, generals, loyal companions, were mournfully silent. All of them were obsessed with one question: what awaited the world after him? The gigantic empire, stretching from the Balkans to India, hung in the balance. The future remained shrouded in dark uncertainty. Behind the palace walls, meanwhile, the legend of Alexander was already taking shape. His name became an oath for soldiers, his deeds, the subject of study for historians. The personality of the great commander grew myths, turning into a symbol of greatness, which will inspire generations 2,000 years later. But how did the son of the Macedonian king raised by Aristotle manage to reach such unprecedented heights? How did he, in just a few years, conquer half of the then-known world? The secret was not only in brilliant victories on the battlefields. Alexander the Great did not just win battles, he made history. In it surprisingly combined the strategic genius of the commander, a subtle political calculation of the ruler, the irrepressible ambition of the conqueror, and incredible charisma, in front of which even the most ardent enemies fell. His army, overcoming deserts, the highest mountain passes, and turbulent rivers, never lost faith in his invincible leader. Alexander was not just building an empire, he was creating a new civilization, where Greek culture and Eastern wisdom were harmoniously intertwined. His name was often mentioned alongside the names of such giants of history as Napoleon, Genghis Khan, and Caesar. Napoleon, studying Alexander's military strategies, dreamed of repeating his triumph, even sleeping, as legend has it, with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, just like Alexander himself. Genghis Khan, like Alexander, created a vast empire, but unlike him, did not seek cultural synthesis, focusing only on conquest and domination. And Caesar, upon seeing a statue of Alexander, exclaimed, "By the age of 30, he had conquered the world, while I have done nothing." This event, according to historians, was a turning point in the life of the great Roman emperor. But what will happen next? What awaits the world after the death of the great Alexander? You will find out in the next part. Alexander the Great is not just an outstanding military leader, whose name would have long been erased from the memory of posterity. He became a legendary symbol that transcended time. Roman emperors emulated him, Arab chroniclers knew him as Iskander, and medieval Europe sang of him in countless tales. Modern culture continues to use his image as the archetype of a brilliant but ruthless conqueror, a man before whom no barriers existed. Alexander's name has become synonymous with ambition, power, and genius, but at the same time, and ruthlessness, cruelty, and loneliness of the ruler, unable to stop at what has been achieved. But who was the real Alexander, devoid of mythological halo, a man of flesh and blood? How did he come to power? What made his army follow him to the fringes of the world? And what caused the fall of the greatest conqueror of the ancient world? Sources that tell about the life of Alexander the Great is a complex interweaving of historical data, legends, and artistic interpretations. Up to our days have not reached the original works of Alexander's contemporaries. All information about him is based on later sources created centuries after his death. Among the most authoritative authors who wrote about Alexander's life stand out Arrian, Plutarch, Quintus Curtius Rufus, and Diodorus of Sicily. It was their writings that shaped the image of Alexander that we know today. Among the most authoritative chroniclers of the life of Alexander the Great is Arrian, who lived in the 2nd century AD. His seminal work, Alexander's Anabasis, relies on the testimony of eyewitnesses, Ptolemy, an associate and future Egyptian king, and Aristobulus, an experienced engineer and participant in the famous campaigns. Arrian, striving for impartiality, nevertheless did not avoid some idealization of Alexander's image, presenting him as a shrewd ruler and a brilliant commander. A different perspective is presented in the works of Plutarch, the author of the comparative biographies, who viewed Alexander through the prism of biography and philosophy. Instead of detailing his military campaigns, Plutarch focused on Alexander's personality, his motivations, aspirations, and individual traits. His narrative is replete with legends, such as the story of the young Alexander subduing the unruly Bucephalus, or his decisive resolution of the Gordian knot. Plutarch skillfully used vivid, dramatic episodes to reveal the character of his hero, but it is difficult to consider his work a purely historical study. The Roman historian of the I century AD, Quintus Curtius Rufus, created the history of Alexander the Great, characterized by vividness and dramatic narrative, but is characterized by low reliability. The work is full of fictions, speculations, and rhetorical devices typical of Roman historiography of that time. It portrays Alexander not only as a brilliant general, but also as a cruel tyrant, especially in the last years of his life. Diodorus of Sicily, who worked in the 1st century BC, included the narrative of Alexander in his large-scale historical library, covering world history. Its description of Alexander relies on earlier, now lost sources. However, Diodorus was not always critical of the information, often simply recounting entrenched legends. Mythologization of Alexander's image in ancient sources is explained by several factors. Already in his lifetime around him, legends were formed, actively used in the political and ideological struggle. Alexander himself cultivated the cult of his own personality, proclaiming his divine origin, and his campaigns represented not as conquests, but as a sacred mission. In addition, authors of subsequent eras viewed him through the prism of their own political and cultural values. The Romans saw him as an ideal commander, the Greeks as the successor of Hellenic glory, and the Oriental authors as a powerful ruler comparable to the Persian Shahanshahs. How true are the legends about the great commander? Ancient authors describing Alexander the Great relied on available information, but inevitably reinterpreted them through the prism of their own beliefs. Some information, such as dates of campaigns, strategic goals, and battle outcomes, seems relatively reliable, as it is confirmed by several independent sources. However, the identity of Alexander himself, his motivations, and even the circumstances of his death all remain the subject of scholarly debate. Historians have to painstakingly reconstruct the picture of the past, comparing various testimonies and taking into account the influence of political propaganda. As a result, the image of Alexander known to us today is a bizarre weave of fact and fiction, where historical reality is closely intertwined with idealized ideas, artistic speculation, and political interpretations. Already the legend of his birth, the brightest example of the desire to turn the life of the commander in the myth. From childhood, Alexander was surrounded by stories about his divine origin, which not only pleased the young prince, but also served as a powerful tool to strengthen his power. Whether he was really the son of Zeus or whether it was a well-thought-out political campaign to legitimize his rights to the throne is a question that still worries researchers. The centerpiece of the mythology surrounding Alexander the Great was the visit of his mother Olympias to the Oracle of Delphi. Even before the future conqueror was born, the oracle predicted to Olympias that her son would become like a lion, invincible and endowed with divine power. In parallel, according to many sources, Philip II, Alexander's father, received a different, more disturbing prophecy from fate. In a dream he saw Olympias, beside which a huge serpent was wriggling, and her body was surrounded by a sparkling glow of lightning. The interpreters of the dream interpreted the vision as a sign of the divine origin of the future child. Olympias herself later supported this version, hinting at the heavenly origin of her son, born not of a mortal, but of Zeus himself. Snakes and lightning are traditional symbols of the supreme god of Olympus, and his relations with mortal queens were a common motif in Greek mythology. The legend of Zeus and Olympias' union put Alexander on a par with Heracles and Perseus, also believed to be sons of the supreme god. These stories not only flattered the ego of the young king, but also strengthened his position among the Macedonian nobility and the Greeks, who treated the Macedonians with some disdain, considering them barbarians. Alexander's divine origin made him not just a man, but a chosen ruler worthy of obedience. The political significance of this myth was particularly pronounced in Egypt, where Alexander was officially recognized as the son of Ammon, the Egyptian god identified by the Greeks with Zeus. The priests of the temple of Ammon in Siwa hailed him as a demigod, and in response, Alexander began to call himself the son of Zeus Ammon. This was not just a ritual gesture, but a way to equalize himself with the great Eastern monarchs who ruled not only by force of arms, but also as children of the gods. Some researchers consider all this to be just a skillful political game designed to consolidate power. However, in the ancient world, the divine origin of the ruler was not just a myth, but the basis of his legitimacy. The belief in the supernatural origin of Alexander allowed him not only to unite the Macedonians, but also to conquer entire civilizations, making them see him not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler. Thus, the question remains open. Who was he really, the son of the Thunderer, or a brilliant politician who skillfully used the myth to his advantage? The answer depends on the degree of our faith in the power of ancient legends that continue to stir minds today. Was Alexander the Great the son of Zeus, as legend has it, or a brilliant politician who skillfully used myth to consolidate power? Undoubtedly, the myths of divine origin strengthened his authority, but legends alone do not become a great conqueror. The real basis of his future triumphs was laid not by Olympus, but by the power of the Macedonian state, created by his father Philip II. If Alexander is remembered as a great general, Philip should be recognized as a great statesman. He did not just hand over the throne to his son, he radically changed Macedonia from a small Balkan power to a powerful military empire. By the time Philip died, all of Greece was under his control. His army was considered the most disciplined and capable in the world, and he himself was preparing to march on Persia. Such was the power that Alexander inherited. But were his brilliant victories solely to his credit, or did he merely benefit from the fruits of his father's labor? What was Philip's role in his son's upbringing, and why was their relationship so uneasy? When he ascended the throne at the age of 24, Philip II inherited Macedonia in a deplorable state, devastated by wars with Albanians, Thracians, and Athenian mercenaries, with a ruined economy and an aristocracy torn by internecine conflicts. However, Philip not only retained power, but also began a systematic strengthening of the state. A key step was a major military reform that transformed the Macedonian army into a formidable, strictly disciplined force capable of conquering vast territories. At the heart of this reform was the Macedonian phalanx, a unique tactical formation that ensured Philip's army was virtually invincible. The lengthening of spears to 5.5 meters turned them into deadly pikes, while increased mobility and the introduction of compulsory year-round training created a professional army, unlike the Greek militias, unquestionably loyal to the king. But Philip realized that infantry alone was not enough to dominate Greece. So he reformed the Geter, an elite guard cavalry of heavily armed horsemen who attacked in wedges and could break through enemy formations. This cavalry, composed of Macedonian nobles, became the striking force of the army and played a decisive role in Alexander's future triumphs. However, Philip's genius was not only in military affairs. He was not just a conqueror, but a far-sighted strategist and politician. Instead of brute force, he preferred subtle political maneuvers, dynastic marriages, favorable alliances, isolation of opponents. Realizing the centuries-old fragmentation of Greece, Philip methodically weakened individual polities, achieving subjugation with minimal losses. Thus, he avoided an open clash with Athens, preferring isolation and deprivation of allies, and Thebes was subdued without destroying the city. The culmination of his policy was the brilliant victory at the Battle of Chaeronea, where the Macedonian phalanx crushed the combined forces of the Greek polities. After this triumph, Philip created the Corinthian Union, formally uniting the Greek polities under his hegemony. Despite the discontent of many, Philip was able to secure recognition of his rule without destroying the Greek political system. Even with his grandiose successes, Philip II of Macedon was far from the ideal of a wise ruler. Like many powerful monarchs, he made many enemies, both inside and outside Macedonia. His many affairs were openly displayed, creating tensions within the family. This culminated in Philip's marriage to the young aristocrat Cleopatra, a member of the powerful Eurydice family. This union caused a serious rift in the royal court, as it promised the emergence of new heirs, whose rights to the throne could be stronger than those of Alexander, whose mother Olympias was a foreigner from Epirus. At the wedding feast, in the heat of merriment, Cleopatra's uncle Attalus announced the imminent arrival of a legitimate heir to the throne. Deeply hurt, Alexander threw his goblet at Attalus. The enraged Philip, also intoxicated, tried to attack his son, but tripped and fell. Alexander, watching his father with disdain, caustically remarked, "Here is a man who is plotting a trek from Europe to Asia, but can't even cross this hall." After this scandal, Alexander and Olympia were forced to leave Macedonia. However, Philip later reconciled with his son, realizing that despite the difficult relationship, Alexander remained his most talented successor. The peace proved to be short-lived. A few months later, at the wedding of Philip's daughter, the king was assassinated by his bodyguard Pausanias. The murderer was immediately eliminated, but the motives for the crime remain unclear. One theory points to personal revenge. Pausanias had been humiliated by Attalus and felt abandoned by Philip, who had not defended his honor. Other theories suggest a political conspiracy, perhaps involving Olympias, who harbored a hatred for Philip, or even Alexander himself, who feared the emergence of a rival for the throne. Whatever the culprit, Philip's death was a turning point in Alexander's life. He immediately seized power, ruthlessly eliminating all potential rivals, including Philip's infant son by Cleopatra, and established himself on the throne. But Philip's legacy proved unbreakable. In every battle, strategic decision, and political move, Alexander felt the influence of the man who had turned Macedonia into an empire before Alexander claimed the throne. Unlike his father, Alexander was not a pragmatic ruler, but a dreamer, a conqueror, seeking not just power, but immortal glory, which defined his greatness. Around the figure of Alexander the Great formed the image of not only a great commander, but also an enlightened ruler who deeply comprehended philosophy, science, and art. This reputation is largely due to his training under Aristotle, the legendary philosopher of antiquity. However, how true is the portrayal of Alexander as a true student of Aristotle, having fully internalized his ideas? Or is it just an episode of biography that had a relatively minor influence on his views? At the age of 16, Alexander was given a mentor, Aristotle. Philip II, Alexander's father, wanted the heir to the throne to receive not only a fundamental education, including literacy, oratory, and logic, but also preparation for government. Philip set aside the sanctuary of the nymphs at Mia for Alexander and a few young men from the Macedonian nobility. Here, under the guidance of Aristotle, Alexander spent 3 years. According to legends, it was during this period that he became interested in medicine, zoology, rhetoric, and philosophy. But unlike Plato, who idealized the philosopher-ruler, Aristotle believed that the ideal king is first and foremost an active man, not a contemplative. This approach reflected the values of the Macedonian elite, where military and managerial talents were valued above abstract thinking. The widespread belief that Alexander the Great constantly carried Homer's Iliad and reread it before battles is nothing more than a legend. There is no direct confirmation of this, although it is known that Aristotle prepared for him a special edition of the poem with highlighted important fragments. Alexander probably drew inspiration from the Iliad, identifying himself with Achilles. However, how deeply he comprehended the philosophical ideas of the work remains a mystery. Most likely, the Iliad served as a model for him of the behavior of an ideal hero striving for glory in spite of danger. Despite Aristotle's influence, the views of teacher and student diverged over time. The key point was their different attitudes towards the barbarians. Aristotle, being an adherent of Greek elitism, considered Greeks superior to other peoples. In the Macedonian king Hamdana, the defender and civilizer of barbarian lands. Alexander, on the other hand, having familiarized himself with the diverse cultures of the conquered territories, chose the path of integration rather than domination. He assimilated the traditions of the conquered peoples, accepted Persians into his army, married women of the East, and even adopted the Persian style of dress. This approach shocked many of his associates, who had been brought up in a spirit of Greek superiority, and probably provoked the condemnation of Aristotle, who believed that a ruler should not blend in with his subjects. The central point of divergence in the views of Alexander the Great and his teacher Aristotle was the understanding of the essence of power. Aristotle, a follower of Plato, defended the idea of a limited monarchy, where the ruler obeys the laws and the advice of those close to him, serving above all the prosperity of the state. In contrast, Alexander, especially after the conquest of Persia, leaned more and more toward absolutism. His power became unlimited, as evidenced by the introduction of worship rituals previously unique to Persian kings. He sought not just leadership among equals, but deification, which caused discontent among the Macedonians, who refused to participate in the proskynesis ritual, considering it humiliating for free Greeks. Ultimately, it can be argued that Alexander departed from the philosophical principles of his mentor, replacing them with the Eastern concept of a sacred kingdom. However, Aristotle's influence on Alexander cannot be downplayed. Even without following his teachings literally, Alexander adopted from his teacher a thirst for knowledge, an interest in culture, and a desire not only to conquer, but also to transform the world. It was probably his philosophical training that allowed Alexander not just to destroy existing empires, but to create new ones, contributing to a unique cultural synthesis of East and West. Despite his rejection of many of Aristotle's postulates, the influence of Aristotle's philosophical ideas on the formation of Alexander the Great's personality is indisputable. His thirst for knowledge, strategic talent, and ability to manage a multinational state, all of this, in all likelihood, was the result of learning from the great thinker. However, even with all of Alexander's preparation for reign, Aristotle could hardly have predicted such a rapid and dramatic rise of his student to the pinnacle of power. Alexander's life changed abruptly on one fateful day. The death of Philip II suddenly put the young man in the epicenter of a fierce struggle for power. Was the Tsar's assassination an accident or the result of a conspiracy? Who benefited most from this tragic event? And was Alexander himself involved in his father's death? The death of Philip II remains one of the most intriguing and momentous mysteries of ancient history. This death not only marked the end of the era of the great king, but also opened the way for Alexander to unlimited power. However, it is still unclear, was this murder a coincidence, an act of revenge, or the result of a finely crafted conspiracy? Who benefited most from Philip's death? And can Alexander be seriously considered a suspect? In 336 BC in Aega, the ancient Macedonian capital, there was an atmosphere of wedding festivities. The daughter of Philip II of Macedon, Cleopatra, was marrying King Alexander I of Epirus. The event had not only family significance, but also profound political significance, cementing the alliance between Macedonia and Epirus. At that moment, Philip II was at the height of his power, having already united Greece under the banner of the Corinthian alliance and preparing for a major campaign against Persia, a plan that would crown his reign. Fate, however, decreed otherwise. During a solemn ceremony in a theater surrounded by a large retinue, Philip II fell victim to an assassination attempt. His bodyguard, Pausanias, suddenly gave the king a fatal blow with a dagger. The assassin tried to escape, but was immediately neutralized by the guards. For a long time, the official version of the murder remained a version of revenge. Ancient sources describe Pausanias as a man of noble origin, however, fell into disfavor at court. The reason for this, according to historians, was a conflict with Attilos, Cleopatra's uncle, and Philip's new favorite. Legend has it that Pausanias had previously enjoyed the favor of the king, but after the appearance of Attilos, his influence weakened considerably. In an attempt to regain his position, Pausanias insulted Attilos by questioning his military abilities. In response, Attilos and his supporters humiliated Pausanias, and Philip did not stand up for him. From that moment on, Pausanias held a grudge and devised a plan of revenge, which he executed at the wedding feast. However, many historians question the version of the murder of Philip II as a simple act of revenge. Too many circumstances were favorable to the murderer. The absence of an escape attempt and the instant death of the criminal excluded the possibility of any explanation. All this suggests a carefully planned conspiracy, but who could have been its organizer? The first and most likely suspect is Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great. Her hostility to Philip was well known. Philip's marriage to Cleopatra significantly worsened Olympias' position at court, jeopardizing Alexander's right to the throne. Moreover, being not only a queen but also an influential priestess of the cult of Dionysus, Olympias retained considerable influence. Historical sources testified to her brutal massacre of Philip's young wife and her newborn child after the king's death, which eliminated Alexander's last rival in the struggle for power. This suggests her interest in eliminating Philip even before the assassination was committed. But was Alexander involved in the plot? Opinions of historians differ. On the one hand, Alexander's swift actions after his father's death, leaving no room for doubt, immediately gathering supporters, securing the support of the army, and eliminating potential rivals, speak in favor of his knowledge of the plot. The rapid elimination of Philip's allies after his death and also supports this theory. It is unlikely that Alexander would have punished the guilty without knowing about the conspiracy in advance. On the other hand, it is difficult to imagine the young prince, already in a difficult position at court, capable of organizing the murder of his father, especially in such an open manner. In the circle of suspects in the murder of Philip II, in addition to Olympius and Alexander, appear Persians. Philip's preparation for war against the Persian Empire made his elimination favorable for King Darius III. Assertions of some historical sources about connections of Pausanias with Persian agents support this version, though there is no direct evidence of Persian involvement. Regardless of the true culprits, the death of Philip II abruptly changed the course of history. The plan for a grand campaign against Persia passed to the young Alexander. Whether he was guilty of patricide or simply took advantage of the situation is an open question, but it is clear that without this tragic event, his rise to power would have looked different. Philip's death ensured Alexander's meteoric rise, but his power in the first months of his reign remained precarious. Discontent persisted in Macedonia, and the Greek polities recently conquered by Philip saw his death as a chance for independence. While Alexander was consolidating his power, rebellions were breaking out all over Hellas. The young king needed decisive action, otherwise his ambitions could collapse before they could be realized. During these critical months, the fate of his power was decided, whether Alexander would rule only Macedonia or all of Greece. The death of Philip II opened a tempting prospect for Athens, getting rid of the Macedonian threat and regaining its former independence. Demosthenes and other influential orators immediately seized the moment, calling for a liberation struggle. The Athenian polis began active preparations for war, forming an army and making alliances with other Greek city-states. The Athenians were supported by the Thebans, who had long resented Macedonian rule and longed for independence. The Theban revolt, which began with the siege of the Macedonian garrison in Cadmea, took on the scale of a call for pan-Hellenic resistance. Alexander, however, unlike many young rulers, demonstrated exceptional decisiveness and promptness. Immediately after asserting power, he led his army and in a matter of weeks reached the borders of Greece. The Thebans, not expecting such a swift reaction, were taken by surprise. Alexander, without prolonging the conflict with negotiations, quickly surrounded Thebes. The Thebans' refusal to surrender, reinforced by insulting propaganda calling Alexander a barbarian, exacerbated the situation. This direct humiliation involving his ancestry enraged Alexander. He decided on a severe punishment that was to be a frightening example to all who would dare to defy him. After a fierce battle, Thebes fell to the onslaught of the Macedonian army. Alexander the Great, not sparing the victor, ordered the complete destruction of the city. The houses were razed to the ground, the inhabitants were exterminated or enslaved, and the city was wiped off the face of the earth. The only exceptions were the temples and the house of Pindar, the famous poet whom Alexander revered. The ruins of Thebes became a grim warning to the whole of Greece. Any rebellion against Macedonia would be ruthlessly crushed. The fall of Thebes caused a shock in Hellas. Not a single polis thereafter dared to oppose Alexander. However, if Thebes was completely destroyed, why did Athens, which had also revolted, escape a similar fate? The answer is simple. The Athenians, having witnessed the Theban tragedy, immediately sent ambassadors to Alexander with a guilty head. Moreover, Alexander realized that the destruction of Athens would not have brought him any strategic advantage. Unlike Thebes, which was primarily a powerful military force, Athens was the center of Greek culture and intellectual life. Their destruction would have caused widespread discontent in Hellas. And Alexander, despite his brutality, already knew how to think strategically. It was far more profitable for him to keep Athens under control, preserving its existence, than to turn it into a pile of stones. As a result, Athens retained its autonomy, although it was forced to recognize Alexander's authority. All Greece realized that the son of Philip II had not only consolidated his power, but also confirmed its absolute superiority by force of arms. The way to the east was now open, and no one in Hellas was going to prevent it. Greece was conquered, and no polis dared to challenge Alexander any longer. The goal to which his father Philip had aspired now lay before Alexander, ready to be realized. The son was to realize his father's grand design. In 334 BC, Alexander the Great, crossing the Hellespont, began his brilliant campaign against the Persian power, beginning the era of grandiose conquests that changed the course of world history. However, he was opposed by a colossus, the Persian Empire, stretching from Egypt to India, possessing seemingly inexhaustible resources, a multi-million army, and powerful fortresses in key cities. Obviously, military forces alone were not enough to conquer such a powerful state. Brilliant strategy, the ability to adapt to circumstances, and filigree precision of calculations were required. Alexander's first serious test was the Battle of the Granicus River. After the invasion of Asia, the Macedonians rushed eastward, liberating the Ionian Greek polities from the Persian yoke. This liberation campaign secured Alexander the support of the local population, established a secure beachhead, and reinforced his image as a liberator rather than a conqueror. However, the Persian satraps, unwilling to give up the lands of Darius III without a fight, concentrated their troops and took a favorable defensive position on the border of Asia Minor, choosing the bank of the Granicus River for the battle. The Persian army, occupying the dominant heights, positioned cavalry along the river and infantry and Greek mercenaries on the uplands, ready to attack in case of crossing the Macedonians. Arriving at Granicus, Alexander the Great was confronted with the suggestion of his commanders to postpone the crossing until the dawn. More favorable conditions of visibility and weather seemed to them a valid argument. However, the king, having shrewdly assessed the situation, realized that postponement would only strengthen the enemy's position and undermine the morale of his own legions. The decision was made instantly: attack immediately. The Macedonian cavalrymen were the first to rush into the turbulent waters of the Granicus, aiming to reach the opposite bank. However, the rapid flow of the river significantly slowed their progress, and Persian archers, occupying an advantageous position on the hill, rained down a hail of arrows on them. A fierce battle ensued. The Macedonians, struggling with the current and enemy fire, hardly kept their balance. Their spears were sinking in the water. The situation seemed critical, and the success of the attack hung in the balance. But in the midst of the battle, Alexander, leading an elite group of cavalry, rushed into the thick of the battle. The decisive attack of the Macedonian nobility pierced the Persian flank, scattering the enemy ranks and turning them into panic flight. Persian cavalry, demoralized by the rapid pressure, trembled and began to retreat. Behind it, having already crossed the river in advancing dense, inexorable formation, followed the Macedonian phalanx. Persian infantry could not withstand the onslaught and was crushed. The Greek mercenaries, left unsupported and without hope of success, fled the battlefield. Alexander the Great's triumph at Granicus marked not just another military victory, but a turning point in his Asian campaign. Its significance goes far beyond the battlefield. Firstly, Alexander's brave act, personally leading the attack, not only inspired his army, strengthening the warrior's faith in his king, but also significantly undermined the enemy's morale. Secondly, this battle convincingly demonstrated to the Persians not only the power of the Macedonian army, but also its ability to win victories in the most difficult conditions. However, the key factor in Alexander's success was his ingenious psychological warfare, aimed at demoralizing the enemy even before the battle began. The Macedonian king understood the destructive power of fear, which could break an army faster than any weapon. Alexander skillfully created and cultivated the image of an invincible hero, always going ahead, despising fear and injuries, leading his soldiers to imminent victory. These legends, spread throughout the East, were an integral part of his military strategy. His orders, his actions on the battlefield, enforced the aura of his invincibility. In the conquered cities, Alexander showed respect for local customs and traditions, spared the temples, appearing not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler. However, any resistance was brutally repressed, serving as an intimidating example for others. Rumors of the Macedonian king personally leading attacks in a hail of arrows, overcoming rivers and emerging victorious from any traps, sowed terror among Persian commanders, forcing many to retreat before the battle began. Thus, Alexander the Great waged war not only with the sword, but also with the power of the myth he created, the legend of the invincible king. The triumph of Alexander the Great at Granite opened the gates to the interior of Asia Minor, opening the way not only to the untold treasures of the Persian Empire, but also to new unpredictable dangers. After this decisive battle, the conqueror moved unstoppably eastward. Having subjected to his will many cities that had once been under the Persian yoke, Alexander demonstrated the indestructible power of his army. Even at the height of his military victories, however, he did not overlook the importance of symbols that could enhance his influence and reinforce the myth of his divine origin. One such symbol awaited him in the heart of Anatolia, in the legendary Gordion. There, according to legend, rested the mysterious Gordian knot, an artifact shrouded in a prophecy of domination over all of Asia. The story goes that Gordius, an ordinary farmer, became king of Phrygia after an oracle predicted that the new ruler would be a man who arrived by wagon. In gratitude to the gods, he sacrificed his chariot to Zeus, securing it to a temple column with an incredibly complicated knot. The knot remained unsolved for centuries, and the prophecy claimed that whoever could untangle it would gain power over all of Asia. In the spring of 3003 BC, Alexander the Great, having reached Gordia, could not ignore the legendary knot. The debate about how exactly he accomplished this task has not subsided to this day. Antique sources offer mutually exclusive descriptions. According to one of them, Alexander, showing ingenuity and respect for ancient tradition, discovered and extracted the hidden fastening pin, easily unraveling the tangled ropes. Another, more widespread version paints Alexander as a resolute and impatient ruler. Without wasting time on painstaking unraveling, he cut the Gordian knot with a single blow of his sword. This act acquired a deep symbolic meaning, emphasizing his unyielding will, his readiness to break the established rules and create his own way. Regardless of the course of events, the myth of the cut knot spread rapidly throughout the ancient world. Alexander masterfully used the story for his own political purposes, demonstrating not only his outstanding military skills, but also his predestination to dominate Asia. For his army and allies, it was further proof of his exceptionalism. For his enemies, it was an additional source of fear and terror. The legend of the Gordian knot strengthened Alexander's image as a leader who did not wait for a convenient moment, did not hesitate, and did not obey outdated laws, but forged his own destiny. This powerful symbol accompanied him in further fateful events. First of all, in the upcoming confrontation with Darius III and the decisive battle that was to determine the future of the Persian Empire. The legend of the Gordian knot cut by Alexander strengthened the faith of Macedonian soldiers in the exceptional destiny of their king. However, fate was preparing Alexander's severe tests, where not mythical prophecies, but only the steel of swords and the power of the army determined the outcome of battles. In the depths of Asia, Alexander met Darius III, the King of Kings. The rapid advance of the Macedonian army could not go unnoticed by the Persian ruler. Darius, realizing the threat, gathered a huge army to personally stop the invaders. In the fall of 333 BC, on the plains near Issus, clashed two of the greatest armies of the ancient world, a duel that determined the fate of the empires. Darius commanded a vastly superior force, but his army suffered from significant shortcomings. The motley Persian army, composed of warriors from different provinces, with different languages, tactics, and levels of motivation, contrasted sharply with the disciplined Macedonian army. Unlike the Macedonians, for whom victory meant new riches and glory, many Persians fought out of a sense of duty or under pain of punishment. Alexander led an elite, well-trained army, where each soldier clearly knew his duties and unlimited faith in his leader. In addition, Darius made a strategic mistake, choosing an unfavorable battlefield. The Persian king counted on numerical superiority, but the narrow plain of Issus nullified this advantage. The Macedonians successfully held their defenses, not allowing themselves to be surrounded. The discipline and tactical flexibility of the legendary Macedonian phalanx gave Alexander a decisive advantage in the battle. At the decisive moment of the battle, Alexander the Great, leading a cavalry strike on the right flank, broke through the defense of the elite Persian detachments. At the same time, the Macedonian infantry courageously repelled the attacks of the bulk of the Persian army. Seeing the hesitation of his guards, Darius III made a fatal mistake, preferring flight to battle. The Persian king, surrounded by his personal guards, left the battlefield. leaving the army without command. This instantly caused panic and turned the retreat into a rapid flight. The Macedonians had won a crushing victory. However, Alexander, despite the possibility of immediately pursuing and capturing Darius, made a different decision. He concentrated on capturing the Persian camp, which contained not only untold wealth, but also Darius's family, his mother, wife, and children. This strategic maneuver was of great importance. Alexander now had a powerful political tool, Darius's family members, which emphasized not only the Persian king's military defeat, but also his inability to protect his loved ones. The Battle of Issus was not just a military victory, but a symbol of Alexander's absolute superiority over Darius. The Macedonian king demonstrated not only military prowess, but also outstanding military leadership talent, unparalleled in history. His soldiers were further strengthened in their belief in the invincibility of their king. But while Darius was alive, the war continued, and Alexander faced new, incredibly difficult challenges, including one of the most significant battles of his life. Alexander the Great's triumph at Issus demonstrated not only his military prowess, but also his strategic genius as a nation builder. However, despite the crushing victory, the war with Persia remained far from over. Darius III was still at large. Instead of directly pursuing the defeated king deep into the Persian Empire, Alexander took an unexpected maneuver, sending his armies south to Egypt. This decision was not just a tactical move, but an element of a large-scale political strategy. The liberation of Egypt from the Persian yoke should have strengthened Alexander's authority, presenting him not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler, liberator of the ancient land. The Egyptians met Alexander as a deliverer. 200 years of Persian domination, despite the formal preservation of the influence of Egyptian priests and aristocracy, deprived the country of true independence. The Persian kings regarded Egypt as a remote province, and the local priests saw them as strangers who disregarded sacred traditions. Unlike many conquerors, Alexander had a deep respect for local customs and beliefs. From his first days in Egypt, he demonstrated reverence for the local gods by performing sacrifices in temples and reaffirming the privileges of the priesthood. This was an unmistakable sign to the Egyptians that he was not a conqueror, but a liberator, a messenger of the gods. The culmination of the Egyptian campaign of Alexander the Great was his mysterious pilgrimage to the Oracle of Amun-Ra in Siwa. The sanctuary of Amun, revered since ancient times as one of the most sacred places on earth, was famous for its soothsayer, whose predictions were considered unquestionable. For the Greeks, Amun was the equivalent of Zeus, and Alexander's visit to the oracle was not just a formal visit from the ruler of Egypt, but a quest to confirm his divine identity. The grueling journey through endless desert expanses, the ordeal of unbearable heat and water scarcity only increased the mystical aura of this enterprise. Met in the temple with the greatest honors, Alexander was granted access to the oracle. The content of the prediction is still shrouded in mystery. According to one version, Alexander inquired about his destiny and received confirmation of his divine descent from Zeus Amun, destined to accomplish great deeds. Another version says that the priests, following tradition, simply called Alexander the son of a god, as was customary for pharaohs. But Alexander took this as a literal confirmation. Whatever the truth, after the Siwa visit, doubts about his divine mission dissipated. He became not just a Macedonian king, but the chosen one of the gods who had acquired the right to world domination. This event radically changed his attitude to power and presumably his very perception of himself. Alexander's return to Egypt was marked by the founding of Alexandria, a city that later became a symbol of the Hellenistic era. However, the Egyptian triumphs turned out to be only an intermediate stage on the way to the decisive battle with Darius III, on the outcome of which depended on the fate of the entire Persian Empire. After the Egyptian victories, Alexander ceased to be just a Macedonian king. He felt himself a legitimate heir to the great Eastern powers, but the complete crushing of Persia remained his main goal. Despite the loss of Egypt, Darius had managed to raise a new, large army and was preparing for the final battle. In the fall of 331 BC, two armies faced off at the Battle of Gaugamela, and the fate of the East depended on their clash. The Persian army greatly outnumbered the Macedonian army, according to various sources, from 200 to 500,000 soldiers, including cavalry, war elephants, and selected mercenaries. Darius chose an open plain for the battle, expecting to use the numerical superiority of his cavalry to maneuver and encircle the enemy. It looked as if Darius had learned from past mistakes and prepared for Macedonian tactics. But Alexander again dictated his strategy, and the discipline of his army predetermined the outcome of the battle. The Persian cavalry made an initial dash, seeking to encircle the Macedonian forces on the flanks. King Darius's strategy was to use his numerical advantage to completely destroy Alexander's army. But Alexander, anticipating this maneuver, masterfully simulated a retreat, attracting the attention of some of the Persian cavalry and artificially weakening the flanks of his formation. At this critical moment, Alexander, leading a guard of Getares, struck a lightning blow in the very center of the Persian troops, right in the area of Darius' location. This unexpected breakthrough sowed panic in the Persian ranks. The threat of Darius' capture caused general chaos. The king, not waiting for the outcome of the battle, fled the battlefield, leaving his army without command. Deprived of leadership, the Persian soldiers turned to flight. Darius' fate was sealed. Retreating into the depths of his possessions in order to gather new forces, Darius faced the betrayal of his closest allies, who realized the inevitability of imminent retribution from Alexander. Conspirators led by satrap Bessus, who dreamed of the Persian throne, killed Darius. However, this attempt to save the empire was in vain. Having learned of Darius' death, Alexander declared himself the rightful heir and continued his triumphal campaign to the east. Alexander the Great's triumph at Gaugamela elevated him to the pinnacle of power, transforming him from conqueror to ruler of all Asia. The ancient cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis opened their gates before him, and nothing could block the way to new, unknown lands, from the vast deserts of Central Asia to the mountain ranges of India. The death of Darius and the victory at Gaugamela made Alexander the undisputed ruler of the Persian Empire. However, the farther his eastern campaigns extended, the more significantly his methods of rule and attitude towards his former companions changed. The Macedonian army, hardened in battles under Philip II, increasingly expressed dissatisfaction with the new orders. Alexander, adopting Eastern traditions, began to demand from others emphasized deference, surrounded himself with Persian advisors, and began to pursue goals beyond the usual perception of the Macedonians. This caused growing tension in the army, causing the king to see potential conspiracies everywhere. The tragic manifestation of this heightened conflict was the execution of Philotas and the murder of his father. Parmenion, men long considered Alexander's staunchest associates. Philotas, the son of the legendary general Parmenion, who commanded the elite guard of the Getares and belonged to the king's inner circle, increasingly came into conflict with Alexander. Like many veterans, Philotas disapproved of the introduction of Oriental traditions at court and criticized Alexander's growing confidence in the Persian aristocracy. His bluntness and self-confidence made him uncomfortable for the king, and his influence in the army aroused suspicion and apprehension. In 328 BC, a conspiracy was uncovered in the camp of Alexander the Great. Dimnus, an officer of the Macedonian army, accused of preparing an assassination attempt on the king, preferred death by his own hand to arrest. The investigation revealed the involvement of Philotas in the plot, who reportedly failed to report the impending assassination attempt in a timely manner. A military tribunal convened by Alexander convicted Philotas. Under the pressure of torture, Philotas confessed to treason, but it is still unclear whether this guilt was real or whether he merely said what the king wanted to hear. On Alexander's orders, Philo was executed by his own associates. However, the story did not end there. Parmenion, Philotas' father, was at the time in Nekotana, responsible for the vast treasures of the Macedonian treasury. Despite the lack of any evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy, Alexander could not afford to take such a risk. Realizing that news of his son's death might encourage Parmenion to rebel, Alexander sent messengers to him with forged royal decrees. Unsuspecting Parmenion was killed when he met the messengers. This cruel act demonstrated to all Macedonian commanders the ruthlessness of the king and his complete lack of any hesitation in matters of power. Now none of his cronies felt safe. This act showed Alexander's total intolerance for even the slightest doubt of his absolute authority, even from those who had helped him build his vast empire. However, such a show of force changed the atmosphere in the army. More and more Macedonians saw their king not only as a brilliant commander, but also as a ruthless ruler, ready to eliminate anyone he thought posed a threat. The upcoming wars in Central Asia and India now threatened not only external enemies, but also possible discontent among his own soldiers. Alexander the Great's triumphant proclamation as ruler of Asia after the defeat of Darius III and the fall of Persepolis did not mean the end of the Persian Wars. Eastern satrapies and local rulers showed reluctance to recognize the new king. Some Persian commanders, among whom Bessus, Darius' assassin, stood out, continued to fight hard for independence. For the complete conquest of the East, Alexander had to go deeper into Central Asia, where he expected the most difficult and lengthy military campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana, the lands that have long been famous for their implacable resistance to the conquerors. Bactria, spread over the territory of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, became a stronghold of resistance to Macedonian rule. Bessus, who had declared himself the new Persian king, had fragile support, and many local rulers were watching developments expectantly, ready to defect to the stronger. Alexander realized that the upcoming war was strikingly different from his previous brilliant victories. He would not only have to participate in major battles, but also apply flexible guerrilla tactics, overcome the most difficult mountainous terrain, rebuild destroyed cities, and confront the deep mistrust of the local population. The conquest of Bactria and Sogdiana stretched for many years. The Macedonian army met fierce resistance of mountain tribes who took refuge in impregnable fortresses. One of the main pillars of resistance was the Sogdian ruler Oxyart, a faithful associate of Bessus. His citadel, rising on a sheer cliff, was considered impregnable. However, Alexander the Great, showing exceptional military talents and strategic thinking, took it by storm. Among the captives was the daughter of Oxyartes, Roxana, whose beauty, according to legends, struck the commander himself. This marriage alliance was not only a personal triumph, but also an important political step. Alexander realized that military domination is not enough for long-term control over the East. Marrying a representative of a noble Bactrian family allowed him to get closer to the local aristocracy and reduce tensions with the conquered peoples. It was a powerful symbolic gesture, demonstrating Alexander's desire to unite East and West, not just conquer. However, the act caused resentment among Macedonian commanders. Many perceived the marriage as a departure from tradition, a fascination with Eastern culture, and a disregard for Macedonian warriors. A union with a barbarian princess seemed unusual and even insulting to the Macedonian elite, accustomed to dynastic marriages within the Greek world. Nevertheless, Alexander continued his policy of integration, encouraging marriages between his officers and women from conquered lands, forming a new elite combining Greek and Persian elements. Marriage to Roxana became one of the key elements of his concept of a multinational empire. However, after Alexander's death, the fate of this union took a tragic turn. Roxana gave birth to a son by Alexander, but during the wars of the Diadochos was in the epicenter of the struggle for power. The marriage, conceived as a symbol of unity, led to the death of Roxana, as Alexander's successors no longer saw her as a symbol of unity, but perceived her as a threat to their ambitions. Having completed the conquest of Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander the Great met no equal among Asian rulers. Having defeated the last legitimate Persian king, he subjugated vast lands stretching from Egypt to Central Asia and seemed ready to proclaim himself ruler of the whole world. But his ambitious designs extended much farther. Subdued Persia appeared before him only an intermediate stage on the way to grandiose goals. Alexander saw himself not only as the heir of Achilles and Heracles, but also as the successor of the greatest Eastern rulers. His eyes were set on India, a mysterious, unexplored country known to the Greeks only through legends and myths. Striving to reach the limits of the known world, in the spring of 326 BC, the Macedonian army crossed the Indus, opening a new chapter in the history of conquests. The fragmented nature of the Indian kingdoms, often feuding among themselves, made Alexander's task much easier. Rapid subjugation of several small principalities, conclusion of alliances with local rulers, and replenishment of the army with Indian warriors. These were the first successes. However, soon on the way of Macedonian stood a serious opponent, King Porus, ruler of a powerful state on the banks of the Indus. Porus, an experienced commander with excellent knowledge of the terrain, had an undeniable advantage over Alexander's previous enemies, war elephants, whose power and imposing appearance instilled terror in the hearts of soldiers. The battle on the Indus River was a serious test for Alexander the Great. The king of Por, having settled on a favorable defensive position behind the river, used the swift current as a natural barrier. However, Alexander, masterfully applying his favorite tactics of deception, simulated preparations for forcing the river in one place, so that under cover of night to discreetly move troops to another. In the morning, the Indian army was caught by surprise. The Macedonian cavalry had already landed on the shore. Despite the suddenness of the attack, the Indian soldiers showed incredible resilience. Particular danger for the Macedonians were war elephants, capable of breaking the phalanx or scattering the cavalry. But Alexander quickly found a solution. He ordered to rain a hail of arrows and darts on the elephants, aiming at the eyes, trunks, the most vulnerable places. At the same time, the Macedonian cavalry made maneuvers, preventing the elephants from deploying in full force. The wounded and frightened animals, falling into panic, crushed their own warriors. After several hours of fierce fighting, Porus's army was defeated, and the king himself was seriously wounded. During a meeting with the captured Porus, Alexander asked him about his desired fate. According to legend, Porus proudly replied, "As with a king." This answer stunned the Macedonian ruler. Instead of execution or humiliation, Alexander returned Porus's title and even expanded his holdings, making him a vassal. This decision once again showed that Alexander was not just a conqueror, but an outstanding commander, able to turn defeated rulers into allies. Nevertheless, the brilliant victory in India was a turning point in the conquest campaigns of Alexander the Great. After thousands of kilometers of grueling campaigns and countless battles, discontent was brewing in the ranks of the army. Alexander's announcement to continue the campaign to the Ganges met with a categorical refusal. For the first time in the entire Indian campaign, Macedonian soldiers openly expressed reluctance to continue fighting. Exhaustion, homesickness, and frightening stories about impassable jungles and powerful unknown kingdoms instilled fear in them. Alexander's attempts to persuade the army were unsuccessful. Even his undoubted authority and charisma could not break the stubbornness of the exhausted soldiers. With a heavy heart, Alexander recognized the limit of the expedition's capabilities and ordered its return. Thus ended the last major expansion of the great commander. Although India was not completely conquered, Alexander's eastern campaign became legendary. He demonstrated the effectiveness of Macedonian tactics even against unknown opponents in distant lands, and his strategy led to the creation of a vast empire that bridged east and west. However, the return journey promised new, no less serious difficulties, and Alexander the Great himself was never destined to see his native Macedonia. The return was the beginning of the end of his great era. Having completed many years of campaigns, marked by triumphant battles and extensive conquests, Alexander the Great returned to Babylon, which became the heart of his vast empire. In the spring of 324 BC, he began preparations for a new massive military campaign, the conquest of the Arabian Peninsula. His designs extended far beyond mere land conquest. He planned to establish new trade routes, build ports, and consolidate his influence in the eastern Mediterranean. Arabia appeared to Alexander as a key strategic region, offering access to untold riches and resources that could greatly enhance his power. However, fate decreed otherwise. A few weeks after the start of preparations for the campaign, the great commander suddenly fell ill and died suddenly, leaving behind many unsolved mysteries. The circumstances of his last days are covered with the darkness of obscurity. Ancient sources tell about a sumptuous feast in Babylon, where Alexander, in the circle of his closest associates, indulged in fun, discussing plans for future conquests and enjoying wine. However, after this feast, his health deteriorated sharply. The disease progressed rapidly. First his voice disappeared, then his strength ran out, and soon he was bedridden. For 12 days his condition steadily worsened, and at the age of 32 he died before he could appoint a successor. The death of Alexander the Great remains one of history's most intriguing mysteries. Among the many versions, the most popular is the version of poisoning. The sudden deterioration of health after the feast, excruciating symptoms, including loss of speech and general weakness, in the absence of signs of infectious disease, point to it. The poison was presumably put into the food or wine. Motives could have varied: displeasure among Macedonian generals at Alexander's adoption of Eastern traditions, fears of the Macedonian regent Antipater of losing power, or even the desire of Olympias, Alexander's mother, to eliminate potential rivals for her grandson. However, the slow progression of symptoms is at odds with the effects of most of the poisons known at the time. An alternative hypothesis suggests a fatal disease. Sources describe fever, weakness, abdominal pain, and a gradual fading of strength. Scholars speculate malaria, typhoid fever, or a viral infection contracted during Alexander's many treks through tropical regions. The high mortality rate among his soldiers in similar conditions indirectly confirms this version. Another hypothesis links death to an autoimmune disease. Perhaps Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that causes paralysis and failure of vital organs. An interesting fact is the report that Alexander's body did not decompose for several days after his death, which some researchers attribute to severe dehydration and circulatory disturbances characteristic of this syndrome. The death of Alexander the Great, regardless of its causes, put a tragic end to his ambitious plans, but left behind a vast empire that quickly descended into the abyss of internecine wars. The absence of a designated heir provoked a fierce struggle for power between his commanders, Diadochos, which led to the fragmentation of the empire. The era of the great conqueror came to an end, giving way to the Hellenistic era, where his influence on the cultural, scientific, and political development of the world was felt for centuries to come. The death of Alexander gave rise not only to a cult of personality of the late king, but also to a sharp political intrigue around his burial. The absence of a will and instructions regarding succession to the throne served as a catalyst for a power struggle among his generals. Just as important as the question of power, however, was the question of the great ruler's resting place. In the ancient world, the burial of a ruler had a deep sacred meaning. Possession of the remains symbolized the legitimacy of claims to power. Alexander's body became a symbol of imperial heritage, and each of the Diadochi sought to take possession of it, using it as a tool in the struggle for control of the empire. Ancient Macedonian custom prescribed the burial of deceased kings in Agus, the capital of Macedonia, next to the tombs of other rulers of the Argeadic dynasty. Initially, after the death of Alexander the Great, his body was carefully prepared for shipment to his homeland, embalmed, placed in a golden sarcophagus, and mounted on a luxurious funeral chariot. However, fate ordered otherwise, and Alexander's return to Macedonia did not take place. During the transportation, Ptolemy, one of the most influential Diadochos, intercepted the procession and took possession of the sarcophagus, transporting it to Egypt. This was not just an act of forcible possession, but a cunning political maneuver. Ptolemy realized perfectly well that possession of the remains of the great commander would considerably strengthen his power and legitimacy of rule in Egypt. At first, the sarcophagus rested in Memphis, one of the largest Egyptian cities, staying there for several years. Subsequently, Ptolemy's heirs moved it to Alexandria, the new capital founded by Alexander himself. A city conceived as Alexander the Great's burial site in Alexandria became the heart of the Hellenistic world, turning the warlord's tomb into an iconic place of pilgrimage. The tomb, with its sacred sarcophagus, attracted not only ordinary believers, but also influential rulers, philosophers, all who sought to honor the memory of the great conqueror. Roman emperors, for example, often visited this place, wishing both to pay tribute to Alexander and to receive, even if symbolic, legitimization of their power. Thus, Julius Caesar, having set foot on Egyptian soil, first of all went to the sarcophagus. Octavian Augustus, who ascended to the imperial throne, also visited the tomb, even touching the mummified body, according to legend, inadvertently breaking off part of his nose. Subsequently, according to legend, Emperor Septimius Severus ordered the tomb closed to the public. Even Kalaka, known for his admiration of Alexander, brought his valuables, rings, weapons, clothes, to the sarcophagus. Yet despite all its fame, in late antiquity, traces of the tomb vanished without a trace, falling out of the historical chronicles. There are several hypotheses attempting to explain this disappearance. Some researchers suggest that the tomb was destroyed by powerful earthquakes that often shook Alexandria. Others believe that the sarcophagus may have been moved or hidden during the early Christian period when pagan shrines were systematically destroyed. Finally, there is speculation that fragments of the sarcophagus may have been used as building material in the construction of buildings in Alexandria or even in Cairo. The location of the tomb of Alexander the Great is still one of the most intriguing mysteries of history. Despite centuries of searching by archaeologists and historians, the tomb of the great commander has not been found. Alleged burial chambers have been discovered in Alexandria, and some sarcophagi have even been considered as potential resting places for the king, but none of these finds have brought definitive confirmation. It is likely that Alexander's final resting place is hidden beneath layers of modern urban development, patiently waiting for the moment when light will once again illuminate one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. The death of Alexander the Great was the beginning of the rapid disintegration of his vast empire. The conquests he had created, seemingly unbreakable during the king's lifetime, quickly collapsed after his death like a house of cards, stripped of the piece that held its integrity together. Despite possessions stretching from the Balkans to India, Alexander did not have a clear succession plan. When asked who would get his empire, he is said to have replied only, "To the strongest." This succinct but momentous statement caused a fierce power struggle between his commanders, the Diadochos, each of whom considered himself the most worthy heir. The essence of the problem was the absence of the empire of Alexander the Great, of Macedon's slender system of management. The great general, not just a king, held under his rule a multitude of nations, armies, and elites, relying on personal charisma and the power of arms. He, while leaving the previous rulers in place, did not take care to create strong state institutions that could function independently of his personality. After Alexander's death, the entire system was held together solely by military force, and his loyal generals proved incapable of cooperating and obeying each other. Nominally, power passed to the minor Alexander IV and his half-brother, Philip III, but both were too weak to effectively rule the vast empire. The real power was in the hands of the Diadochos, the most influential generals of Alexander. Thus began the protracted wars of the Diadochi, which lasted almost half a century. As a result of the rapid collapse of the empire, Ptolemy I gained a foothold in Egypt, beginning a dynasty that ruled for 300 years. Seleucus IV controlled the eastern territories, creating the powerful Seleucid Empire. Antigonus and his successors held power in Macedonia and parts of Asia Minor. Each of these new states claimed to be Alexander's rightful successor, but in reality all their energies were devoted to internecine warfare rather than to preserving the integrity of his grand empire. It is noteworthy that Alexander the Great's influence on political life did not fade even after his death. Many of his successors, the Diadochi, emphasized the connection with him in every possible way, imitating his managerial style, minted coins with his portrait, and declared themselves legitimate heirs. In Egypt, Alexander was given divine honors, and the Ptolemies masterfully used this cult to consolidate their power. In Asia Minor and in the East, the image of Alexander was perceived as a standard of the ruler, harmoniously combining Greek and Eastern traditions. Even centuries later, Roman emperors such as Caesar and Augustus sought to compare with him, seeing in Alexander the ultimate measure of greatness. Thus, despite the rapid disintegration of his empire after his death, Alexander's legacy proved incredibly durable. He not only reshaped the map of the world, but laid the foundations of Hellenistic civilization, an era in which Greek culture, language, and science spread over vast territories, giving rise to a unique symbiosis between East and West. After Alexander's death, his image was not just preserved in the memory of generations, but transformed into legend. He became a symbol that transcends the historical personality. His name is covered with myths, traveling through the centuries and acquiring new meanings. For some, he is an ideal ruler and a brilliant general. For others, a messenger of the bombs whose campaigns changed the course of history. In medieval sources, Alexander's image was transformed, becoming part of epic tales, chivalric novels, and even religious narratives. The enigmatic interpretation of Alexander the Great's personality in Islamic culture presents him as Zulkarnain, the two-horned one. The Quran mentions this righteous ruler who traveled extensively and built a protective wall against the invasion of the tribes of Gog and Magog. Although the Holy Book does not directly identify him, authoritative medieval Muslim historians such as al-Tabari and Ibn Khaldun have established a connection between Zulkarnain and Alexander. The origin of the nickname Two-Horned is possibly explained by Hellenistic depictions of Alexander wearing a helmet with horns or ram's horns, symbols of his kinship with Zeus. In medieval Europe, the image of Alexander underwent significant transformations, becoming the central figure of chivalric novels and Latin chronicles. The novel about Alexander attributes to him incredible deeds, fantastic adventures, meetings with mythical creatures. In these narratives, he appears as an ideal ruler, a brave warrior and a wise philosopher, striving for knowledge of the world, exploration of uncharted lands, and immortal glory. Legends even tell of his daring attempt to ascend to heaven in a griffin-drawn chariot, interrupted by the Huns, who reminded him of his mortal nature. The image of Alexander the Great in the 7th to 8th centuries in the expanses of Russia and Eastern Europe occupied an honorable place. He was revered as a standard ruler, often compared with such outstanding personalities as Peter the Great and Catherine II. In Russian historiography, he appeared as a symbol of state power, and his brilliant military strategies served as an example of unrivaled military talent. In Asian countries, Alexander's name sounded like the embodiment of a great emperor, not only a conqueror of lands, but also a builder of civilizations. In Iran, the perception of his legacy was ambiguous. On the one hand, he was seen as the destroyer of the Persian Empire. On the other hand, he was included in the Persian epic Shahnameh under the name of Iskandar, which indicates his subsequent integration into Persian culture. Thus, the image of Alexander the Great continued to live and transform for centuries, turning into a universal symbol of power, ambition, and wisdom, encompassing both the West and the East. Different cultures found in him their unique features. Greeks, an ideal hero; Muslims, a just ruler; and Europeans, a great conqueror who conquered the world. 33-year-old Alexander the Great died, but his name is immortalized in history. His deeds go beyond the usual conquest. He reshaped the world, creating an empire that, despite rapidly disintegrating after his death, forever changed the political map and cultural life of the ancient world. Alexander is the benchmark image of a conquering general, for no one has achieved such grandiose successes in such a short period of time, turning the modest Macedonian kingdom into a power spread over 3 continents. His campaigns are not just military campaigns, but a catalyst for the spread of Hellenistic culture, language, philosophy, and science, laying the foundation for the what would have happened if he had continued to live. This question is one of the most fascinating historical mysteries. Perhaps he would indeed have reached the limits of the then world, conquering Arabia and Carthage. Or perhaps he would have faced powerful opposition and internal intrigue. One thing is indisputable: his longer reign would have further strengthened the influence of Alexander the Great's contribution to history is inestimable. His strategy and tactical decisions have served as a role model for many prominent generals, from Roman legionaries to Napoleon to modern military strategists. His brilliant victories are still studied today, and Alexander himself appears to us as an ideal commander who boldly challenged the world and achieved amazing success in conquering it. But the story of his life also contains an important lesson. Even the most powerful empire, created by the power of one man, is not eternal and cannot exist solely because of his personality. Alexander left behind a transformed world, but failed to ensure its unity and integrity. Nevertheless, his name is forever inscribed in the annals of history as a symbol of boundless ambition, exceptional talent, and unquenchable desire for the heights of power.